Welcome to dotNYC number 10. Today we're going to talk about trolls and trying to recapture civility online with my good friends Elizabeth Spiers, who is the founding editor of Gawker, and Anil Dash, a real pioneer in blogs and web culture. It's like old home week for me, trying to recapture some of the magic we saw from the early days of the web before it was captured by trolls. Stay tuned. Hey, this is dotNYC number 10, I think. And like earlier in the week, we're going to have a discussion show. This time the topic is trolls, nasties, and other abhorrent beings. Yes, we'll deal with Donald Trump as well. And I'm really happy to have two old friends. I'm the old one, but these are old friendships. Back from the early days of blogging and the internet, and two of the brightest people I know through this world. Elizabeth Spiers, who was the founding editor of Gawker, and went on to start a whole bunch of financial blogs, and went on now to work in VR most lately, and was also the editor of the New York Observer before its Trump age. Anil Dash goes back to the earliest days of blogging as well, where that's where we met each other, and most recently founded ThinkUp, which was a great service with Gina Trapani, and is now moving on to save the internet and such. And so, Elizabeth, you tweeted out this morning that you had breakfast with Nick Denton, and then you were coming to see us, and you said it was like time travel back to 2002.
Anil is actually responsible for Gawker in a way because he introduced Nick and I at a Metafilter.
I don't think we need to phrase it that way, given what happens when you're in the line of fire taking responsibility for Gawker. But I have always been, more than willing to sort of take an undue amount of credit for that introduction.
And it was Nick Denton who introduced me to blogs, and I will confess that I first said, well, what's the big deal? You made a page. And I didn't know it at all. Then I also remember sitting around Nick's kitchen table many years ago with Elizabeth and Pete Rojas debating comments. Mm-hmm. And Nick was dead set against having comments. And you had put out some kind of mechanism where people could give you tips, and it was working for you. And then Nick was saying, well, okay.
But that was just email.
We tried comments for like 5 minutes. We had them up for a day or two, and there just wasn't, we didn't have the bandwidth to moderate them, and so it was kind of a mess, and he pulled them back off. But then I think by probably a year or two later, everybody had comments, and so we would have been behind, I think, if we'd left it that way.
And comments got the cooties as a reputation of being the gathering point for trolls and idiots and lowlifes.
There's an interesting thing, though, the rationale. And I mean, this is what I was doing. I was saying earlier, like it's like an arms dealer for selling the tools for publishing blogs and doing comments. The rationale for so many publishers was, well, everybody else is doing it. Like that was all it took to be like, why are you doing comments? Well, you have to have them. To what end? And I mean, I was as guilty of it as anybody, but to be like, oh, that's just simply how you check the box without sort of any regard to like, what does it mean? What's the purpose of it?
Well, I think also the readers started to develop a kind of sense of entitlement about it.
Oh,
like,
absolutely.
Where am I supposed to respond if you don't have a comment section? And for a while, Nick's stock response to that was start your own blog.
Which was true, and I actually think was legitimate in the sense that if you're going to devote your own space to saying something that has more value.
Well, I think people are more accountable when they have to talk on their own real estate, and they're not just coming in and trashing yours. So,
my other theory about comments was that it was a fundamentally insulting architecture that said that we don't really care to hear from you until after we're done with our work, and then we'll allow you to deign to comment on our stuff. And then the anger that you have at us is you're finally going to listen to us, but you're not really going to listen to us. So we're really going to come out fighting. And then of course Nick and Gawker. With Kinja saw a whole different world for comments, and tried to put that in front.
Well, I think he's still, we actually talked a little bit about this morning. He's still very interested in the problem of, how you invite user engagement and make, for instance, like sources more transparently part of the story in the sense that they can respond I don't think Kinja ended up doing that, but I understand the intent behind it.
So I want to bring you together to talk about civility online. And and whether it's a fool's errand to try to get it. I guess start here. Have each of you, I presume the answer is going to be yes, but have each of you been affected by trolls?
Sure.
So any anecdotes, any...
Oh, yeah. You can start.
I did this story for Matter a couple of years ago. Medium bought Matter. It was a magazine, and this was one of their first forays into long form journalism. And I was doing this profile of a woman named Shanley Kane, who runs a publication called Model View Culture, and she's an activist. She's she talks about diversity in tech, and she does good work. But she's also a prolific tweeter, and her sort of response to anybody who's not perfectly aligned with her opinion is "go fuck yourself," and then it's just nuclear war. And
What's
so
the
I did
magic word. You got the bell.
yeah, I did so I did the story on her, and I went to San Francisco. I spent 4 hours with her, came back, and I sent her a follow-up email. It was just give me some people that I should talk to who've worked with you and who know you. And she emailed me back and said, "I've decided that you can't talk to anybody." And if you say something like that to a journalist, they're So I emailed her
Red
back
cape in
and
front of the
said,
bull, yeah.
"Yeah," I said, I'm asking as a matter of courtesy. I'm not asking for permission." And a few hours go by, and then I start getting emails that she's tweeting at me, and so I go look at Twitter. And she's tweeting out to all of her followers that I'm harassing her family and friends. Now, at this point, the only person I've spoken to is Shanley. I don't even know who her family and friends are. And I've never had a source do that to me, like where somebody just makes something up out of thin air and then has enough of a credible following that all these people just take it at face value that that's actually what is happening. So I was getting trolled by Shanley's followers for a while until I was able to produce evidence that, here's what happened, and no, I haven't contacted anybody she knows. And then I wrote the piece, and I gave it a few weeks, so I wanted to try to make it as even-handed as I could under the circumstances, but I disclosed what had happened in the piece. And then the sort of alt-right crazy people went after me because they thought I was going to easy on Shanley. Yeah. So there, at one point, I was being trolled by both Shanley and Milo Yiannopoulos simultaneously. So
we're gonna get back to Milo.
So there's an interesting thing. I mean, I think, and I know Shanley a little bit, and I also am, I'm sure, on her outlets. But I think there's this. She's interesting as an activist because there's this like Overton window she's shifting, right? So like rhetorically, what she does on Twitter is they're like, if you're not aligned with this set of values, I'm going to push until you're either like sort of, submissive or you're acknowledging what I said, and very antagonistic. I think there's a terminology challenge, which is like her techniques are extremely aggressive, but she's never like published somebody's address, gone after it. Like there's a difference in terms of.
Well, she did make those threats to me, so I wouldn't. I don't know that.
Okay, I don't know. I mean, to my knowledge,
I wouldn't say that she's.
So how have you been touched by a troll?
Well, and I mean, so there's a really range, and I, maybe that's a bad example, but I think there's a challenge where the other day there was two conversations going on about trolling at the same time. One was Fred Wilson and a number of sort of other tech VC investor types. And the other was Chrissy Teigen, the supermodel, and her husband is John Legend. And at the same, literally at the same time in my Twitter timeline, Fred was saying, well, I think a troll is somebody who just like gives you a hard time online and is being really annoying, but they're not the abusers, the harassers, the people that really attack you. That's his definition of the terminology. And Chrissy was saying the exact opposite, which is like, well, there's people that annoy me, but the people who are like threatening my family, those are the real trolls, right? And I just thought that so this is one of the challenges we have where we're 15 years into this era, and we still can't even agree on terminology for how to describe the difference between this person's annoying, this person's like harassing me online, and that's frustrating. This person's actually a danger. Right, and like those lines really blend. It's like if we can't even talk about the problem, it's no wonder that it sort of still
maybe
persists.
It's a continuum, and the distinction is harmless troll versus dangerous.
Well, motive matters. Why they're doing it, I think, matters.
Yeah.
So I in Aaron James' book, Asshole's a Theory, right? He defined an asshole. One, allows himself to enjoy special advantages and does so systematically. Two, does this out of an entrenched sense of entitlement. Sound like Trump. Three, immunized by his sense of entitlement against complaints of other people, right? So I came along, and I think what distinguishes the troll from the mere asshole is that he, and it's almost always a he, right? Have you ever
Mostly.
been trolled by a woman?
Well,
You well, that's one
my
example.
previous
Yeah, that
example,
But
but,
other than that, it's
no.
rare, right? So that's what made it unusual. So that he, one, has a target, two, seeks to get a response, a rise out of that target, and three, believes he is acting out of some ordained moral purpose to destroy.
Yeah. I think there's a new element, which is more recent cultural development in the last decade or so, which is about the positioning of the underdog, right? Because there's always this power dynamic. Like the justification of almost every troll is like, I'm the underdog, sort of without regard to facts. I mean, like Trump is a great example, like a billionaire who's like, gee, I'm just struggling to get by. Nobody give me a fair shake. It's like, I think maybe they are.
It's considered de facto moral high ground.
Right. And it's an interesting structure, especially as it's been the kind of enthusiastically adopted by people who are really clearly not marginalized, right? And so they're like, well, this technique works.
Yes.
Let me use that technique. But the difference is combining it with that toxicity. And I mean, the examples I have of being trolled, I mean, it's everything from obviously, different times like people calling employers and trying to get me fired to publishing our home address, to really egregious things around like my child, which people going after my child, my wife. Those are like the only times. Like for me, I'm like whatever. Like if you think I'm an asshole, you're probably right. And I'm never bothered by someone being like, this guy's a jerk, or whatever they would say. But I think being able to draw that distinction where. So a lot of these communities, you can point at Gamergate, you can point at the alt-right, you can point at, and I've had the pleasure of engaging with all of them over the years. They'll start with the moderates, the reasonables, who are like, this guy's just wrong, and he's, whatever your epithet is for me, that means you don't like me. And then that's easy, they just block them. What they do is they escalate, right? And that thing about it becomes a competition within a community to get more and more scathing is, I think, what's changed in the level of toxicity online. Because before it was just like, this guy's a jerk and he doesn't like me, and I'm a jerk and they don't, I don't like him, and we're going to be sort of peers. You know what I mean? Like if I say I don't like you and you don't like me, that's kind of the end of it.
Yeah.
To be able to marshal an army to follow you, and I mean, I remember the first time I had that experience was 2002, late 2002 or early 2003, in the run-up to the Iraq War. Charles Johnson of Little Green Footballs had,
Infamous in his day.
Yeah. Well, he's an interesting dude, right?
Yeah.
So he had been mostly a tech blogger, and then I think like a lot of people was sort of caught up in the fervor for war and became, to my views, pretty radically Islamophobic. And I just called him out for it because I saw us as peers. But what I hadn't realized is he'd built what was then a very sizable community, and to have hundreds of people calling my house, calling my boss, those things I'd never seen before. Wow. I think at that era in the blogosphere it was very unusual. Now you just be like, well, it's Thursday, that's what happens. And Charles since then has sort of had a reconsideration of his political views, and we reconnected, and I just I had a chance to talk to him about that moment. Like it's very rare that you talk to somebody that led a mob against you online as.
Did you sense remorse?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think he feels a lot of, like, for not just that, but a lot. I mean, I think
He's
supporting the war is a lot worse than the what you said to somebody online. And I think what we sort of came to understand together, because he's very sophisticated in understanding these things too, is you can catalyze something more vicious and victimizing than you realize if you lead a community. And one of the biggest things online is nobody thinks they lead a community.
True.
True.
Yes.
Except for the real, Milo or Trump or somebody that's like, I'm a great man.
No, and indeed,
for the most
you
part,
may
everybody
not.
denies.
Elizabeth, you said on Twitter you're about to write a piece on the bogus notion of the influencer.
Yeah.
And I want to lead up with that. So I accidentally started Dell Hell back in the day. So you could argue that I trolled Dell because I said Dell sucks, and people gathered behind me with pitchforks and torches to storm Castle Dell and say, yeah, they suck.
Right.
And the argument was made then I was an influencer. I said, no, I wasn't an influencer at all. It was the message that resonated and people agreed with. I had nothing to do with that world.
Anybody with sufficient platform who'd said it would have resonated.
Yes, yes. So this whole fight to start to say, oh, there's an influencer which replaces media as a one-for-one is ridiculous.
Well, there's I don't know if you've seen it, there was a paper by Duncan Watts a while back. about sort of dismissing the notion of influence, or at least the way it's defined by, I think, media and marketers, which is generally somebody who has X number of followers on X platform. And I might be totally mangling his theory, but the gist of it, I think, is that when you see things go viral, and people point to maybe a D-list celebrity, retweeting something, what's usually happening is that there are smaller clusters of people, and the things that go viral because there are like these little nodes of people who by themselves would not ever be defined as an influencer.
Yes. But only
because
through the
most-
collection of them makes it influential.
And the most active nodes are people who tend to be prolific with distribution, but they're usually in terms of archetype, like they're incredibly naive. They promote anything.
Yeah.
So it's like, if we redefined our notion of influencer to mean that, I think a lot of strategy would be different, especially for.
Yeah, so if I had a whiteboard here, I guess I'd start drawing a chart where you have the alpha troll, and then you have the people who march in his army, and then you have the people over here who are the spectators who say, fight on the playground, right? And if we are to have, well, I guess first I'll ask this, do you have any hope that will improve?
I think, I got in a Twitter argument with somebody a couple weeks ago, and one of my friends was like, why are you engaging this person? And I said, because fundamentally, deep down, I'm pretty optimistic about, what the internet can do for dialogue. I also think I've had conversations with people on Twitter where it starts out hostile. They'll tweet something awful at me, and we'll start engaging, and are able to de-escalate into a reasonable conversation. Even though I think, people, there's a myth that doesn't happen. I do think people with patience and you're engaged enough. Like,
well, you have to
all
learn
the
the
time.
skill set to do it, right? Like online de-escalation in 140 characters is really hard, right? And I only learned it out of necessity. Right, because I was like, I can't be fighting the entire internet every day. And I had a guy the other night that's like I think a retiree with a lot of time on his hands, whose like starting position to reply to something I'd said was like, you're an Islamist insurgent who's in favor of terrorism. Like that was just like, hello. And by the next day, which is me wasting my time on Twitter, he was like, we were talking about our kids. Do you know what I mean? And like, there was this because I'm like, listen, I'm just a dude. Like, I'm not like, I know, like I have whatever number of Twitter followers, but I'm like a middle-aged dad, who's like going to take his kid to soccer practice. Like, I'm not your enemy.
Right.
And that humanization is really, really hard, because I think the only thing that de-escalates somebody who's really doggedly attacking is being vulnerable, right? You have to like sort of humanize yourself. And that is not, nobody's like, here's, your Twitter app, you sign up, is like, go follow the Olympics. It's not telling you like, here's how to make yourself vulnerable in a way that's still protected, but that has other people connected with you. Like they don't, nobody at Twitter understands that. Well, nobody, but few. And so like, it is absolutely possible to make systems where abuse is not common and harassment is hard to do.
Yeah, you wrote a great post about that, going through the false myths about managing decent communities and civil discourse.
We've learned it all, but you look at who's building, Snapchat or any of these other tools, and part of it is, if I talk about, we've been having comments online for 15 years in the sort of contemporary model. They were in junior high maybe then, right? And so they weren't paying attention to what we learned then. And if I say, you should do it the way that, Gawker did in 2003, they're like, I wasn't allowed to read Gawker then, right? Because I was still a child. And so there's this like one piece that there is no literacy, and then the tech industry broadly has no sense of history. So the people building the tools, I think there are exceptions. Like I think Medium's made a lot of smart choices, but it's people who've been working on blogging for like almost 20 years. So okay, they make good choices, or but the default tools that somebody's going to put onto a local newspaper site in some little town is like whatever we had off the shelf that we could get for free, that somebody could plug in, and that for them, like if they wanted to learn, say what has been learned about how to manage a community online to not have vicious trolling and attacks in the comments, where would they even go? There's no book on it. No. There's no read this Wikipedia article and follow this checklist and you'll be done. And that's like sort of, for me as a tech guy, that's like shame on us. We never wrote down, if you just do these three things, you would solve the problem.
I think the reaction has been for particularly media companies to just take comments off at this point. Like I feel like that's.
But they're doing that in the same way that they put them on, which is that's what everybody else is doing.
We have to do this.
Well, they were always subordinate, or it's a place for the lessers to come and show up and throw them a bone.
Versus, I don't know if you know the company Harken. Jen Brandel, it enables basically, hi, I'm Jeff, I'm your journalist. What do you want me to do today? And you all have ideas, and I can't do it all. So fight it out among you as to what I should do, and then I'll do it. And so you have an idea about what happens for our recycling, and so you win because you went on social media and said, vote for my idea. And then when I go out and report the story, I take you with me.
So community is assigning editorial.
Yes. So if you move the so-called user up the chain in some way so that they become part of the creation process, that's a measure of respect far greater than comments.
Well, I think that also, but that scares a lot of journalists because they view it as demagoguery. It's if you're crowdsourcing your story selection, are you?
Yeah, I get that all the time, but we are out of touch with the public in terms of knowing what their actual needs are because we don't ask them. That's why I started a whole new degree in social journalism, where that's the job, is you have to go and understand the community first. And B, if you judge our success or failure not on page views and reach and old mass media business models, but instead on whether we've had an improving impact in people's lives, or whether we've actually informed the public. Look at this election, which we'll get to later, but as evidence that we don't do our job.
Yeah, so just to play devil's advocate there, though, you're a Hillary supporter. Let's say you say, okay, I'm going to do this with my community, and everyone in your community says you have to cover Benghazi, even though it's already been covered. Like, how do you respond to that? How do you manage community expectations?
It's true, and it's if you look at The Guardian, which defined itself before it came to the U.S. as the world's leading liberal voice, Alan Rusbridger's argument in the day was that what separated the journalist from the mere advocate was intellectual honesty. And that you would have to deal with Benghazi, yes. Now I choose not to. I turn off the TV when it comes on because I get sick of the email stories. So I'm not putting myself in that case as a journalist. But what separates journalism would be I think more completeness.
I think there's also a focus here on sort of committing acts of journalism, right? Which most of the community doesn't want. That's very little of what we consume online and what publishers monetize online. And so that part of the balance is you're trying to make the same community, like if you're going to deputize them to give you editorial assignments, and you want them to respond to like the cute baby photos or the cute puppy pictures or whatever else you're posting, like that's two different communities. Like that's not even the same people. Like because you generally when you're like somebody ought to write a story, it's because of a grievance, because of some personal connection, because of some some wrong that you want to right. That's a very different motivation than I'm killing time at lunch. And what's a funny video, or what's
you may be the same person, but it's a different use case.
Right, exactly. What's the latest celebrity foibles? It's sort of a very different behavior, and even that those are the same commenter login or the same commenter account, like that doesn't make any sense.
So let's deal with a case or two. Nero Yiannopoulos, who I think has touched all of us.
Milo, yeah.
I'm sorry, Milo, not Nero, Milo. And recently, as we know, was kicked off Twitter, supposedly for life, as if Twitter can do that. First off, what are your thoughts on Milo?
He's a bad actor. It's one of the rare people where, there's an interesting thing that happens in all the sort of profiles of him and people describing him where they do this sort of act of credentialism to talk about, oh, he's smart and he's charming, and I don't give a shit. I mean, the guy's a bad actor and is content to sort of destroy people's lives, to really, really negatively impact them, and really without regard to, there's not some philosophical background for it, right? So there's no seriousness of like, well, this is a cause that I stand for and I don't care who's in my way. He adopted Game Brigade and hated video games, right? So this is there's no intellectual honesty, to your earlier point. What's most striking, but there are bad dudes. What's more striking about it to me is he is savvy enough to be able to capitalize on the resentment of guys who are angry for no discernible reason, and build a community out of them. But there's a tremendous amount of enabling too. I mean, I think
that's that third string of people who cheer him on. Yes,
not just cheer. I think there's a lot of media folks that found the contrarianism charming and think if a British accent says it, it's not awful. And I mean, I saw this where people who are legit media, like Jason Ponton of MIT Review, being like, well, Milo went to a good school, which I'm not I'm not British enough to know what the hell that all means, but I don't care where he went to school. He's still a bad dude. Yeah. And they don't have a infrastructure for actually assigning accountability and repercussions.
So Elizabeth, what's
I also
your
think
experience?
there's this sort of assumption that if someone is smart, they must also be reasonable.
Yes.
And it doesn't account for things like, just raw nihilism, which is what I think, I think Milo's a nihilist. I don't think that, I think if there were more opportunities for him to gleefully troll people on the left, he'd be on the left. Like, I don't think he has a core ideology.
I'm forgetting the name of suddenly of his business that went belly up, and he didn't pay people, and so he finally got attacked.
Yeah.
And it was and he had trolled me back in the day. I can't even remember what for you.
Yeah.
I forget.
It all runs together.
That's a scar I got from him, but I don't know what I was saying on the playground at the moment. But there was a brief moment when he became kind of a puppy dog. When I think he was trying to.
He was humbled by his business
Yes.
failure and by the obvious public humiliation of the fact that he had cheated people out of their money.
And showed some, perhaps.
His version of contrition.
Yes, it might have been very false, but also showed his charm to an extent for that brief period,
Sure.
and then decided to turn it back on, and becomes this. So, what do you think about his banning by Twitter?
I generally, I would say like we should use banning as little as possible, but I do think that the reason why he was banned is that he seemed to be actively trying to mobilize a community to really hurt somebody. And I don't mean like in the metaphorical sense, I mean potentially dangerous, way. And that I think you can't tolerate. Like if you convey to the user base that it's okay to do that,
Yes.
it's like swatting.
Well, these
it's
guys,
just-
these guys with the alt-right and the men's rights activists and, to some lesser degree, the Gamergaters and the neo-reactionaries, and these communities all intersect. But, like, there's a sort of, I don't know what you call the intersection of these things, that like, kind of the hostile internet. There have been multiple people killed by folks that hang out in those communities. Now, I'm not ascribing that they were motivated to do so because of that, but it doesn't, like, being around people with violent rhetoric all the time obviously has an impact on people, and to be able to, point to multiple, accounts of like guys who are hanging out in MRA communities who have, assaulted or killed their partners is like, well, these things are not unconnected. But the communities are not recognizable. It's be like, oh, well, we're on a subreddit together. What responsibility do I have for that guy? But there's these diffuse communities that are able to be galvanized and to act and to really exact a cost, and yet the architectures are sort of perfect for having plausible deniability for everybody involved. You're like,
Right, so let's talk about the architecture. And that's you're both worked around this at Gawker and in tech companies. So that line, Twitter finally put a line and said, if you're going to amass an army to actually harm someone, okay, that's too much. Now we know where Twitter's line supposedly is.
Well, it's
right?
distinguishing between really unpalatable criticism that might even be in bad taste, and it could be, and an actual attempt to hurt somebody. It's not. It's the difference between publishing somebody's home address and then just saying something horrible about you. It's like most reasonable people can distinguish between the two.
What should Twitter's line be?
I think the point at which you're you're putting somebody's life in danger. Like that's
So
that's a
everything
pretty
up
clear
to that
line.
is okay.
I think
not okay,
I would say
but
I go a
you
lot
would tolerate
further
it.
than a lot of people in terms of what's okay, and it could be a function of having been on the internet so long that I have such a thick skin, and people have said, I've gotten like rape threats and things, and I don't. It doesn't bother me as much, or maybe I'm just disingenuously abstracting away from it, but I don't. It doesn't scare me as much as the kind of swatting activity and so-and-so's social
So
security
what
number.
about a 20-year-old young woman who doesn't have that experience and doesn't have that ability?
who we don't want to have
Playing
to
devil's
develop
advocate.
the thick skin.
Right, so exactly. So I'm playing devil's advocate
Yeah.
back.
Yeah.
So there's a standard for Elizabeth.
Yeah, there's probably a continuum.
daughter
I mean,
you
I'm
have.
a little bit, maybe even less vulnerable because I have a bit of a platform. I also think when you look at issues of vulnerability and what moral responsibility around that is, I also put myself out there on the internet. I'm opinionated. And I understand the consequences of that.
Well, we're pros, but there are civilians
yeah.
who get hit, right? And so there's the I mean, like Leslie Jones being targeted by Milo, like this is, the whole Ghostbuster story and all that stuff is a much larger sort of social issue. But her experience is really common for lots of Black women on Twitter, right? Like that's who gets it worst and is targeted by whomever, if it's 4chan and men's rights guides or whatever, and and like I said, most of them are civilians. It's just ordinary folks who don't have our thick skin, are not putting themselves out there, are just talking to their friends, and people can go and search for it. And that's the thing where that attacking like those folks who are not high profile, don't have a verified checkmark, all those other things, that has to be a much higher priority. And I think there should be aggressive banning. Like the thing is, like, it's actually, as we all know, easy to create another Twitter account, right? So like there's no reason to not be aggressive in banning if you think it'll help like indicate to somebody you've crossed a line. And now, obviously, this is where we get into the economics of it. Like, obviously, Twitter has been flat for a long time, and the user count is not growing. And anything that would have them shutting off some significant number of accounts has a real, financial impact and is going to affect their share price. But I think ethically, they're obligated to put these boundaries around it. And part of it is because of these mechanisms we're talking about, of how the abuse works, which is you get a standard bearer who's the leader of the troll army, but they're always like the plausible deniability. Like, I'm not a leader. I just said, wouldn't it be awful if somebody went after this person? Here's her tweet and here's her address, right? And then they have a legion of anonymous followers that do the dirty work, all of whom are using these disposable accounts and anonymous accounts and all these things. Like, immediately close those accounts down. Why would you sort of endure it? And the fact of the pattern is very identifiable. If, like, as a geek, I can imagine you say, find me somebody who is regularly sharing, embedding tweets from somebody else that their followers don't follow, and that it's getting tons of replies addressed to that person. And it's never because, like, we're all fans, right? You know what I mean? That doesn't happen. And to be able to identify that thing and block that behavior programmatically is not that hard.
But to play devil's advocate back, is that we believe in the open internet, I think, and that Twitter's openness is what enables it to foster organizations from the Arab Spring to Black Lives Matter to gather together and to show what's going on in the world. So is it a necessary conclusion that openness is a breeding ground for trolls and bad behavior?
No.
Is there do we have hope for Twitter as an open platform versus Facebook as a more closed one?
Yeah, I mean, when Facebook instituted the real names policy, I thought, that provoked some interesting discussion.
Yep.
I've always written under my own name, and I've had arguments with people with pseudonyms. And I have an ex-boyfriend who had a pseudonym for a long time, and we would have this argument once a week. And he worked for himself, so I completely understand that there are reasons to have pseudonyms that have to do with maintaining your employment and just needing
personal safety, all kinds of things.
Yeah. But for the most part, if you were writing under a pseudonym, I wouldn't have a lot of sympathy. I feel like it reduces accountability.
Yeah.
And
Though let us all be aware that anonymity is not the cause and identity is not the cure. We can all name assholes by name.
Yeah.
But
also anonymity and pseudonymity are treated as interchangeable, and they're very, very different from what happens on a social level, right? So anonymity, true anonymity, where like I have no idea who did this, is online almost impossibly hard to manage. Like, it's very, very rare that you can get a good community with true anonymity. But pseudonymity, where it's like your identity is persistent, but I don't know who you are, enables a lot of the good things where, like, well, we could tell this person consistently is a bad actor, or if they're usually being good, and what their history is, and like this is a one-time acting out, or are they usually bad? But I don't have to know what your name is.
Yeah, that's a valid point. And I think there's been some talk lately of people building media properties on the blockchain and using it to manage persistent identity. And I think some of it's just everybody's excited about blockchain.
Yeah.
They have a hammer
It'll be
real,
3D too.
It'll solve everything. Yeah.
But I agree with you. I think there is a distinction to be made there.
Right. So my little case was it's minor. It's nothing compared to what people go through. But I have an imposter whose name I don't want to say because it's my name, who drives me nuts. And finally, one time went over a line for me and published something in a reputable magazine that made it look like it was from me. And so I said, that's too far. And so I said, take it down. Well, have I suffered since saying that? Because I got a lot of that. I don't defend free speech. That I'm against free speech.
But that wasn't the only thing going on. Right, so that was the initial argument, but it was also, so there's a community of like online leftists, a lot of whom I agree with politically, but that their identity is defined online by picking the things they like and they don't like, right? And so Harambe the gorilla good and Hamilton bad, right? And it's like whatever, like just any arbitrary thing, right? That's, I don't have a strong opinion about either of those things, but like the fact that it's completely arbitrary and they could have flipped either one of those the other way sort of indicates this isn't really serious. And so like you were a Harambe that week, right? But you were like, Jarvis bad. And so they were playing with it. Like you weren't the opponent, you were the ball.
Yes.
Right?
So, but where I want to head, so I don't want to relitigate that.
Sure.
Get me in trouble again. But this notion of free speech, the notion of unlimited free speech, in a private platform, right? And you made that argument back in the post you wrote some time ago. You worked for a company that championed the idea that it's speech uber alles, that speech alone is important. And I have long championed free speech, Lord knows. But I guess my line is that at some point you also have responsibility.
Sure.
And that free speech does not mean you publish everything you could publish, right? Though that was the argument around Gawker's outing of the Condé Nast executive.
Yeah, but in that case, Nick walked that one back pretty quickly.
Yes, he did.
I don't think there's anybody associated with Gawker at this point who would argue that story should have been published.
But his editors quit in protest because they had violated their free
nobody's still
speech.
left there, but there were people there who were like defending
Well, I know
the story.
the editors specifically,
Yes.
but at least the people I know who worked there, everybody was horrified by it. So
Yeah.
So what are the limits of speech in a privately owned domain?
Well, look at, maybe this isn't directly analogous, but, WikiLeaks publishing social security numbers. It's like, there's no news value in that.
Nope.
The only thing it does is put people in danger.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that for a second. That I'm fascinated by that today. In that, I was a supporter of WikiLeaks, a supporter of Chelsea, supporter of Snowden, supporter of all of these things. However, when you start doxing people, in essence, for absolutely no reason, there's a limit. And further in the notion of...
voicemails with people's kids have no news value.
Exactly. But the leak is a lot easier to accomplish today than it ever was, right? You don't have to go Daniel Ellsberg and spend hours smuggling things out and standing at a Xerox machine. And there's more you can leak. So the ability... So what we have to think about, I think, as media properties, as journalists, is whether we have our limits around leaks. And are we encouraging, by our mere presence, by our mere existence, are we encouraging the Russians to hack Hillary? Because we'll use it. The Greenwald doctrine is, as once it's known, it's fair game for a journalist, period.
Were the Pentagon Papers stolen?
Yeah, they were. That's the problem. So that's about my standard. They were stolen for a reason. So Glenn argues that you cannot.
But you have to
it's
know
not
they
our
exist.
job
Well,
to
I
know the motive.
actually, I got in a little bit of a Twitter argument with Glenn over this. Like
Okay.
a few days ago, and I said something about Assange maybe being connected to Russia, and I said, well, he hasn't denied it, and Glenn went off on me and
Yes,
said,
yeah.
well, he has to protect his source, and I said, yeah, that's not what I'm talking about. Like,
Yeah.
I'm a journalist too. What I'm saying is that if he's being funded by them, that should be disclosed, and it's not. Maybe he's not being funded, but like he's not denying
There's
it
no
either,
way to
and that
know.
has nothing to do with protecting a source. That's about conflict of interest disclosure, which is an entirely different issue.
Yeah.
There was also Assange in one of his many interviews right then, when asked, journalists trying to bait him, if you got a leak from the CIA, would you, knowing it's the CIA, would you do it? And he said, oh yeah, no problem. He would be used. He's happy to be used.
There are a lot of concepts that we bring over from sort of classic print journalism onto the online world in a way that it's an ill fit, right? And I think one of them is about conflicts of interest. I think conflicts broadly, we had outsourced that sort of disclosure to a structure within a journalistic institution that most people don't belong to anymore. I think the same thing actually around anonymity, where people were sort of talking about anonymous sources, but anonymous sources were always vouched by the journalists, right? So it's like there's a trusted intermediary saying this is a valid source, and like that thing that goes away when we talk about whether it's anonymous comments or how anonymity is used to publish things online. Like this is on a paste bin on the internet. Like what does that even mean? I don't know who put it there. those concepts are changed because we don't have the sort of somebody like in the past. Basically, you were betting your entire reputation as a journalist on your anonymous source. It's like it should be rare, but you might need to do it. And now it's sort of an everyday occurrence. These concepts keep getting transmuted. I want to step back to one thing, which is about the sort of free speech broadly on these platforms. The contrast I always draw when we talk about what should I be able to say, what should I be able to publish, is how incredibly curtailed free speech is around media content and copyrighted content, right? Mm-hmm. So Twitter, any of these platforms, Facebook, if I want to put up a copyrighted song, I want to put up a Beyonce song, it's down instantly. Like they've got systems to detect it. It's trivial for them. Like it's instantly down or monetized or whatever their response is to doing it. So there's no free speech, right? Like a free speech platform would be, I can put up a Beyonce song and people can listen to it, mm-hmm. right? They've decided for business reasons that is not in their interest. And they're very, very effective at it, and they've spent millions of dollars at tracking it. So we've already conceded that. And I say this all the time, is like I wish that like if we could copyright hate speech and assign it to like, to Warner Brothers and have them go out and root it out and be like, well, we've detected that you're using this racial slur that we own, and our system has automatically taken it down. Like just apply the exact same technologies. We know what it looks like when they apply advanced technologies to removing content.
Sounds like blockchain can solve it.
Maybe.
Well, it's about incentive, misaligned incentives. So, yeah.
It's not, but misaligned incentives, except for a lot of those technologies were developed, for example, at YouTube, when they're actively being sued by those labels, right? So the incentives were like, this is our enemy. They could have doubled down. And all of these, one of the things that comes up all the time is like the platforms that succeed in terms of like using content that violates copyright only succeed if they do it on large scale. So like the fact that YouTube was wide open is why it worked. And because everybody had so much content that violated copyright, or Napster or whatever, but if they had been we're going to try and license one at a time, they never would have sort of succeeded. So like your first step has to be wide open copyright violations, free for all. Then 2, walk it back with this technology. And it's like, well, as long as you're developing a technology to detect something, you could apply that towards detecting, destructive antisocial behaviors as easily as towards who owns the rights to this song.
So I get sick of journalists calling me around, you defend the internet, damn it, because it's making us all stupid, or it's the end of truth. I got that one.
The end of truth.
I got that one just this morning.
Congratulations.
I thought that was Donald Trump's.
Well, that's where I'm headed. That's where I'm headed. So I'm hesitant to declare the age of anything. Mm. But with Donald Trump as the sole piece of evidence, are we in the age of the troll? Do the trolls win? Do the trolls take over?
I don't think so. I think, one of the interesting things that's happening now with Trump is that you have Republican moderates who are coming out and going, okay, this has gone too far. Yeah. And I think if he makes it to the election, and I have a conspiracy theory that he'll find a reason to drop out, it's going to get worse. Like some of his inability to control himself and his... and he is a nihilist, I believe. Like he's, which is why his positions are so inconsistent. He can't keep track of them. Yeah. But I think it's just going to get worse. Like we keep thinking that we've seen the worst thing that he could have done or said. I think there's still stuff coming. So
yeah. There's worse stuff coming. I mean, once you're at the let's use nukes phase, it's all done. There's he is incoherent, and I think that's really important. There isn't a theory or a policy goal. There's no, there isn't some real ambition other than power for power's sake behind what he's doing, and also the sort of like playing to the room and wanting to have an audience appreciate what he's doing. I think there is undeniably an element of the way he engages that is a purely post-social media way of talking to people.
So what does that mean?
So when he says, when it's like, oh, well, Trump said something horrible today, it's one of 2 places. It was in a live event or it was on Twitter. There's no question. Nobody asks, right? Nobody's like, was it on Tumblr? Like that, what I mean? And so we know about what are the formats that reward the outrageous statement, the factless outrageous statement, with attention and all these other things. And that they can obviously carry you very far away. Not maybe, hopefully not all the way, but like they can carry you really far away. And so we've built, one, the attention systems to sort of reward without regard to accuracy, facts, credibility, anything else. And then the economic systems around it. I mean, I think how web monetization works, not to sort of re-legislate things that were decided a dozen years ago, but like you look at the rise of AdWords and AdSense from Google, and before this, like something like links were purely editorial, right? It was like, well, you link to this thing because it was funny or it was interesting. And immediately, Google's PageRank system was sort of voting based on links. And as soon as they added AdWords and AdSense, you realize links have monetary value. And immediately, you go to the Times and it says, this is our page on, Barack Obama. And it doesn't link to like his page or the White House. It links to their topic page about Barack Obama. That shift happened because Google shifted the economics of the web in a way that affected editorial, right? And it closed the network. It closed the sourcing. It reduced the likelihood of linking to source documents. It reduced the likelihood of linking to the perspective of the person you're covering, right? And so like you end up with closed universe media being economically encouraged by the way Google works. And I think nobody's really talked, and people at that point, the fight was still, well, Google News is excerpting our headlines.
Well, it's further, the mass media business model is based on volume, is based on reach. We all have to have the same, we write the same stories, we fill the same page with our own contents, we have our own ad and get our own pennies from it, right? And so what we copy this same stuff. Our goal is purely reach in the mass media business model. It's not impact or value or anything else for people's lives. And so Trump fits right into that because he will create, Leslie Moonves saying again, he said it again, this is wonderful for us. Jeff Zucker saying, this is great times.
Yeah.
No real concern about the fate of the republic they're supposed to inform.
But deeper than that, no accountability for them.
No.
Who can hold these guys accountable that's going to be allowed in a room with them to hold them accountable?
Well, this morning, I think, or maybe it was yesterday, Corey Lewandowski got up and reignited the birther rumors, which is amazing. And it's like, CNN is paying this guy. And the average American doesn't actually understand the difference between a commentator and a journalist in a broadcast context.
No.
And CNN knows it and
if you
exploits
work
it.
in-
CNN knows it and exploits it. My question is about the how do we hold them accountable, right? Like we're all lucky enough, we might sometimes end up in a room with these guys. And I'm I guess obnoxious enough to like go and buttonhole them and be like, this, you're doing something that is morally and ethically
The great Jon
indefensible.
Stewart moment.
Yeah, but what happens is I get uninvited from the event.
Yeah.
There's not here's well, this is a really good point. We're going to change, right? And so you think about the only thing that's going to happen is that's going to be effective has to be sort of economic accountability. And I'm like, it's hard for me to imagine what is involved in introducing, especially on the internet, like economic accountabilities, folks. It's like, okay, well, the advertisers are completely abstracted through these on-demand systems that are like real-time software systems. So they don't even know who their advertisers are. No. So like the idea if I'm going to call the advertiser and tell them this person's spreading lies, it's like not even
media
technically
is
possible.
monetized there. Right, right. It fundamentally changes the business model. I argue we've got to get into the relationship business. I argue we've got to give people relevance and value, and we have to have a relationship of trust, which is lost now. But that's a fundamental change in the business model.
Well, also, we live in a media environment where people believe that, when as much as they think about trust in the media, that a trustworthy media will reflect whatever their personal values are. Mm-hmm. So there's always going to be a swath of media that the average person considers untrustworthy simply because their politics or personal tastes are not being reflected. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of, a narcissistic way of viewing it, but we've created this impression for consumers that they're the customer and the media exists to deliver them a specific product exactly the way that they want it, and very often they're not talking about format or quality, they're talking about a specific message.
Framing.
And if you don't get the message that you want to hear, it's obviously because the media is corrupt.
Right. So let's end here. Since you're all powerful media pioneers, what's the one thing that you wish someone would do or could do or we should do to improve the civility of online discourse? That's a showstopper.
I would say, when we were talking about it at the beginning of the show, learning how to de-escalate things when they, just learning that skill set. If you're going to be a responsible citizen on the internet, like you've got to learn how to do that. And sometimes that means, learning to control your own emotions, because online, when everything's very abstract, it's easy to see everything as this kind of amplified giant thing, when really it's just somebody, and I include us in this statement, having a thought, putting it out there, and it's easy to kind of project motives onto people you disagree with. And so some of it's just, we all have to be responsible citizens and learn how to have difficult discussions with people we don't agree with.
And I would say the other thing I've got to wish people would do is to stop yelling "fight, fight" in the playground, and to stop encouraging the behavior that you rationally don't want to see on the internet. And that's the one thing I do is I call people on and say, is that the internet you really want? And some people say yes. But to
Because
try
they
to get
haven't
the same
been through
into it.
I think a lot of times the naive behaviors around encouraging others to fight or rooting for the fight or thinking it's funny to do things because they haven't been through the real abuse. And so it's this sort of it's just people calling you names online. It's not the same thing. It's there are parts of this that are really awful. To my mind as a technologist, the biggest obligation is on the parts of the people running the platform, since they are some of the wealthiest companies in the history of the world, to be able to say, let's build tools that, one, don't dehumanize people, so that sort of abstract, this isn't a real person on the other end. A lot of that's because of design choices. They're made in ways where you're like, that couldn't possibly be this real, a real person who has actual feelings and a family and or is a human. And then two is the recognizing the patterns. So, the sort of the breathalyzer test before you can drive, right?
Yeah.
Don't tweet angry. We know, this seems a little out of character for you. Are you sure that's what you want to send out right now at 12:30 at night, when you probably could just step away?
Which I have recognized in myself.
Yeah, I mean, we've
call
all
it the
been there.
Cabernet rule that you don't start tweeting when you've had too much Cabernet. And my joke is that I found the loophole, and it's called Pinot Noir. And I will recognize the next morning the difference in my tone.
Yeah, or the times when it's been when my son was young and he was a baby and we'd been up all night, or I was about to get on a plane. It's don't throw the bomb right now. Don't be that guy.
Right.
And then the broader behaviors where we detected a community of people are acting this way. That, from a technology standpoint, is not hard to do, and take the same diligence they have towards protecting copyright, towards protecting all these other things, and apply it to protecting people's lives and their wellness, and also to take seriously even the things that aren't a violent threat, that isn't a obviously actionable thing, to come back and to say, if your experience is merely that you're making somebody miserable every day by coming to this site, that there has to be some work done, and that it's actually solvable. These aren't some magic high-tech thing that needs to be invented. It's not some moonshot. It's just applying a little bit of the enormous resources they have to this problem that they say they care about, but they haven't done anything about.
So I lied. Let me ask one more thing. My kids are much older than yours. Elizabeth has, I'm sorry, Anil, I'm going to say this, the cutest baby on the internet.
No, it's true. My son's not a baby anymore. When he was the winner, and he handed the title over.
So you both have young children, and you were really, truly both pioneers in the blogging and thus the web culture world. What are your hopes and presumptions for your children when they get to have their own Twitter accounts?
I mean, I think the best we can do is just teach them the things that we've learned about, staying safe on the internet, being reasonable. I'm not I have some trepidation about when my son is old enough to kind of use social media, because I didn't grow up with it, and I can't fathom what it would be like to be a preteen in a social media environment. So we haven't figured it out.
The paradox there is it's very hard having a teenage daughter. My wife has concentrated on this a lot, is that it's not so much the trolling and the bullying and all that we hear about. It's the opposite. It's that the people you see have ideal lives and you don't. And by comparison, it makes you miserable, not because they're trying to make you miserable, because they're trying to brag about how wonderful they are.
Everybody's perfect on Instagram.
Yes. Well, although I will say, I think the younger generation is a little more savvy about that. People have Instagrams and Finstas, and one's real and one isn't.
Yes.
And so, which I don't think my generation was. We all have this notion of a singular internet identity.
Yeah.
Yep.
The
And
Zuckerberg
the
thing.
younger generation has better bullshit detectors. Like they know that some of this is fabricated.
And they know the temporal nature of the Snapchat, which befuddles everyone I know over the age of 21, has a different nature. What about you?
My son has a Twitter account. It's now private, but he doesn't maintain it. I just take quotes from him. And I mean, you know,
There's a book in that shit my dad says. Now you can have shit my son
exactly.
says.
As soon as we picked his name, I got his domain name and his Twitter handle and all that stuff because you do that. It's interesting to me. There's a couple things that were really, really insightful to me. One was at the worst of a certain storm I was on online from a certain community that came after me. I was getting a bunch of notifications, and I was putting my son to bed, and we listened to music on my phone. We're going to bed, and the notification bar pops up, and he's a good reader, and it that really staggered me. That was one of the.
Why do they think you're the devil, Dad?
Yeah,
Is that kind of worse?
If only, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And he ignored it, like it didn't register with him, but I immediately turned off all the notifications. That moment of awareness of like his sort of consumption was really profound for me. And I had been thinking for a long time about like whatever I write, he's going to see. Like he's not probably going to be interested in all of it, but like he might search for himself or whatever. Like I don't. I've probably written 1 million words online or something. He's not going to find all that, but he might find parts of it, and so that the trail is visible to him and for the most part permanent because I'm much more of a Twitter than Snapchat guy. That's visible to him has changed my seriousness about how I communicate. I think that's been really important. And I think there's the sort of, as we've all seen, right? Kids absorb your example and they learn, they're watching even when you don't think they're watching. And so to be able to say, like if he watches me say, I'm going to walk away from the computer right now, or I'm going to try and engage thoughtfully with this person even though they came at me flaming them, I'm hoping that's the biggest thing. I'm hoping that's what he sees. And it's a really, it's a hard legacy to sort of maintain, is this idea that he's going to see how I act online in the same way he sees how I act in the neighborhood. And like I would never shout at somebody while we're walking down the street, and berate them. And if I can be that person online too, I think he'll learn from it.
Yeah, and I think that's the best thing I've heard from both of you today. The common theme is this notion of de-escalation. Is that as police in America have to go through de-escalation classes, perhaps so should all of us on Twitter. Thank you very, very much. I'm delighted you came in. Elizabeth Spiers, Anil Dash. This is dotNYC. We're still figuring out what it is. Let us know what you think, please. We're trying to look at the intersection of journalism, media, technology, and everything else in New York, thus technology and fashion and finance and whatever else comes. Talk to interesting people and do it from here at the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism. Thanks and bye.